Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a special installment of our Policy Lab webinar series. Policy Lab is a research center within Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Research Institute, and during the month of May, which is Mental Health Month, we'll be focusing several 15-minute webinars on various topics under the umbrella of behavioral health. You can see a list of the topics we'll be covering on the current slide, as well as a link to the landing page where new webinars will be posted throughout the month. We encourage you to visit our website, policylab.chalk.edu, for more information and to share these webinars and other resources via Twitter, tagging us at @PolicyLabChalk. Today we'll be focusing on the topic of youth suicide and a new study from Dr. Rhonda Boyd, a psychologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and a Policy Lab faculty member. Dr. Boyd, I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
From the slide, you can see that suicide is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 20-year-olds in the United States. The rates for suicide completion and suicidal attempts have been increasing over time. Suicidal ideation can lead to suicide attempts and poor outcomes for youth. Unfortunately, most adolescents experiencing suicidal thoughts do not receive treatment. The purpose of this study was to examine parent-adolescent agreement about adolescent suicidal thoughts and to see if there are demographic and clinical factors associated with the agreement in a large community sample. Previous research has shown that there is low agreement between parent and youth for suicidal thoughts, with most of the attention being on parents not being aware of their youth's suicidal thoughts. Low to moderate agreement between parent and youth has been commonly found in child mental health research, and thus is an important topic to explore as we don't fully understand what to do when there's disagreement or what does it mean. In our sample, we looked at adolescents 11 to 17 years old and their caregivers, who were mostly parents. This came from the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort. There were approximately 5,000 peers. Both parents and their teens were asked two questions. Have you ever had thoughts about killing yourself? And for the parents, they will be asked, have your teen ever thought about killing him or herself? And the other question focused on thoughts about death or dying. We do recognize that thoughts about death or dying may or may not be associated with suicidal ideation, but we thought this was an important question to ask and that it could be associated with suicidal thoughts and risk for later. We looked at agreement through three ways. One was the overall agreement, which is the kappa that was shown on the slide. We also looked at parent unawareness. So that's when the parent said no, however, the adolescent said yes. And then we looked at adolescent denial. So that's when the parent said yes and the adolescent said no. So one of our main findings is that half of the parents did not know that their adolescent had thoughts about suicide and killing themselves. Also, 75% of parents did not know that their teen had thoughts about death or dying. If you look at the kappa, it is actually moderate for suicidal thoughts, the agreement for suicidal thoughts, but it is low for thoughts of death or dying. Next, we'll talk more about that we received media attention focused on this finding, mostly that parents were unaware of their teen's suicidal thoughts. This is an important finding, as we said, but we also thought that it was important that there were a large number of adolescents, almost 50%, who denied suicidal ideation when their parents reported it. And this is a population that we don't know much about, and sort of what are their risk factors. Next, I'll go over the other findings associated with the demographic and clinical factors associated with parental unawareness. So, for thoughts of death and dying, as well as killing self, being of a younger age, parents were more likely to be unaware than when you were an older adolescent. Also, for older boys, parents were more likely to be unaware. However, the trend was opposite for girls. For older girls, parents were more likely to be aware. Fathers were more likely to be unaware compared to mothers. However, on the opposite side, when the teen had a history of therapy and psychiatric hospitalization, parents were more likely to be aware of their thoughts. When we look at thoughts of death, being a racial minority, parents were more likely to be unaware. However, opposite, being of Hispanic ethnicity, parents were more likely to be aware. When there was a family history of suicide, parents were more likely to be aware. So, looking at these findings, we think about sort of the effects of age. For younger youth, they may go unnoticed when they're having suicidal thoughts because parents are more likely to be unaware. Also, we recognize that it appears that mothers may more likely to be aware. And how do we get fathers more involved to be aware about their youth suicidal thoughts? It's not clear why there's a difference based on being a racial minority or being Hispanic ethnicity. We do know that there's research indicating that racial minorities tend to not be in treatment, and so that may correspond with this finding that we shown. One of the positive aspects is that when there is a family history of suicide, it appears that parents may be looking and being more aware that their youth are having these thoughts. Also, the treatment effect is evident, where being in treatment, parents are more likely to be aware. We do not know whether the direction of effect for that finding. It could be that because you're in treatment, parents are more likely to be aware, or whether parents became aware and then put their youth into treatment. So these are the things that we're considering. Next, we'll go on to adolescent denial. There are thoughts of death or dying and killing self. Similarly, with the previous findings, having a younger age was associated with being more likely to deny. However, on the opposite end, having more severe psychopathology, kids were less likely to deny. And also with thoughts of death and dying, racial minorities were more likely to deny. So when we think about this more, these younger age children are more likely to deny, but they're also more likely to be missed by their parents. So this is a group that we need to pay close attention to because their parents are not aware and they tend to deny. This is the case with racial minorities, that they are more likely to deny, as well as they're more likely their parents are unaware. And so this is another group that we have to pay close attention to because they're coming up in both ends and more likely to be missed. So now we think about our findings and what do they mean. One of the things that stood out is the demographic factors of age, gender, race, and culture, and these differences and how they impact potentially whether parents are aware or adolescents denying suicidal thoughts, and that we need to take these factors into account when assessing for suicide risk. and when facilitating adolescent disclosure. Also, we recognize that we have a large number of youth who are denying suicidal thoughts, and we have a large number of parents who are unaware, and that these factors may prevent you from getting the services they need. There is a huge disparity in youth getting the services they need, and when parents are not aware or youth are not disclosing what's going on, this puts them more at risk for delaying treatment and becoming worse. Also, there is a need to collect information from multiple sources when screening for suicide risk. So typically, we ask a teen whether they're having thoughts about suicide. However, we also need to check in with parents because there are important informants about what is going on in the home and what the youth say. We also may want to check in with the school, with teachers and counselors to find out what is happening. We cannot rely on one source because we don't want to miss any youth. Suicide is a serious problem, and we want to make sure that we don't miss any opportunities to be able to help youth who may be at risk for eventually completing suicide. And so we do recommend from all sorts of people who interact with youth to be aware about these risk factors, to be able to talk to youth more openly, and that for providers to be able to not rely on just one source.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd, for walking us through that presentation. As a reminder to folks who are joining us, you can get more information and access additional webinars in the series by visiting policylab.chop.edu. Thank you so much for joining us.